The trouble with a marketplace is that it sort of features a little bit of everything and by association kind of nothing, right? It sort of lacks perspective and doesn't really give the consumer much of a reason. So I think where we want to spend most of our time is thinking about saying no more than we're saying yes, and have a very, very particular assortment that is localized to a given market.
Welcome to Behind the Numbers Brand Anatomy, an all-new eMarketer podcast that looks under the hood of your favorite brands, made possible by Mountain. It's February 9th, and I'm your host, eMarketer Briefing Director Jeremy Goldman. And this is the show that gets inside brands and dives deep into one of their recent campaigns or discusses the ROI behind a new technology they've adopted. Today, we're talking with Matt Alexander, CEO of Neighborhood Goods. Welcome, Matt.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, really excited for our chat. Here's what we have on deck for you all today. First, a speed intro where we get to know our guests in 100 seconds or less. Then, tell me what you really think, where yours truly and this week's guests discuss a few stories and themes in the news that will be highly relevant to marketers. And then we jump into this week's case study, how Neighborhood Goods wins by focusing on experiential retail. All right, Matt. Time for your speed intro, where we get to know you and see how you think on your feet. 100 seconds on the clock. Our producer, Victoria, will be timing you. Your time starts now. First off, what's your core mission at Neighborhood Goods?
Trying to create a new type of department store and sort of a new conversation around what physical retail can mean.
What do you personally think is your strangest quirk?
I have absolutely no idea. I don't know if I have a good one. Am I allowed to pass? Probably not.
You can pass.
I can pass.
There you
I'll
go.
Pass.
We make up the rules as we go along. Favorite recent piece of streaming content?
Yellow Jacket.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
People who send the entirety of an email in the subject line.
You're stuck on a desert island. What 3 non-essentials do you bring?
Probably a bottle of wine. Maybe 2 bottles of wine and a laptop.
What's something you've learned in the past year?
I probably say this every year, but try not to take yourself too seriously.
What's something different than Matt today versus Matt in high school?
I'm a dad relatively recently, which, I think the alarming thing is that I'm very much the same, but I also have a child that looks quite a lot like me now. And so that's certainly a massive difference these days.
I saw a picture of your kid has the same amount of facial hair as you do. It's amazing.
Does,
and number one business leader you'd like to have coffee with?
Oh, great question. My answer would be Stuart Butterfield, the CEO at Slack. I've always just been a fan of how they sort of initially started from a messaging perspective, not taking themselves too seriously and having a lot of fun in an enterprise space. And I've always thought that they have a really curious and interesting perspective.
All right, that sounds good. We got just under the wire. Not too bad. Now it's time for Tell Me What You Really Think. This is a new segment where I pick 1 or 2 stories in the news that'll be highly relevant to brand marketers and get our guests' perspective. So first off, I wanted to get your perspective on a story that we covered for the eMarketer briefing that announced store closures fell 65% year over year in January as openings started to edge up. And I think it's such an interesting story because it seems like a lot of people like to say retail is dead, retail doesn't matter. I mean, I think, obviously the story is a little bit more complex than that. I mean, what do you think about the fact that there are still a lot of retailers that are opening up doors?
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think the narrative around the death of retail is fairly reductive, right? Where I think really what we've seen with the rise of e-commerce is a remarkably effective channel for utility and convenience, where, having a Prime subscription is akin to having an electricity bill, right? Where it provides a lot of that utility and basic access to a lot of different products. And you could say the same thing about just about any website and e-commerce experience, but it doesn't fully resolve for discovery. It doesn't fully solve for, more of a personal relationship with a lot of these products and the general sort of a way to assess a product beyond just reading reviews, which are heavily gamed online. And so, physical stores have a real role to play where you can build a more loyal customer base, you can have an outpost for some of that aspect of utility and convenience, but you can also really lean into that sort of discovery aspect. And discovery, it can mean different things for different brands and different companies, but I think crucially, it allows for just a really sort of close relationship between the consumer and the retailer. And so, that can take a lot of different forms, but I think it's no coincidence that you're seeing a lot of the direct consumer brands in the sort of retail and consumer ecosystem finding real need to get into wholesale or distribution channels of their own stores, because in many respects, operating a store can be more efficient than having a single billboard, right? But it can be that much more productive in terms of sales, that much more productive in terms of forming a relationship with the consumer. And so I think, physical has a real role to play. And I think there was an overcorrection from the fact that a lot of incumbent traditional retailers lost track of consumer behavior and preference. And now is very much this moment, an opportunity for them to sort of recapture that attention and to do it in context with an evolving sort of customer behavior type.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me that, of course, we talk a lot about discovery, but then I thought it was interesting that, I saw Dollar General, this was part of our coverage. Dollar General plans to open 1,100 stores, which is more than every other retailer combined. And it's interesting because there are all of these grocery delivery services that are trying to consolidate, they're trying to acquire one another just because the customer acquisition costs are so incredibly high. And it just seems a little bit obvious to me that there's a lot of value in getting people to go to your physical location and pick up, relatively heavy goods that you're selling that don't have major margins. Why not have people come to you and pick them up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the big sort of growth levers for us in 2020, where our stores, closed just like everyone else. And then we saw a lot of demand for store pickup, same day delivery. We, in as much as our stores double as warehouses, we had stock of product that even a lot of the brands did not have. And so it meant that we were just able to serve customers in a lot of different ways. And I think just something that's been very foundational for neighborhood goods from the very beginning, but I think it's true for just the broader industry, is that the customer has to be able to dictate their own terms as to how they want to transact with you. And sometimes that's going to be, walking into a space and then buying online. Sometimes it's going to be buying online, having it shipped straight to you. Sometimes it's going to be same day delivery. Sometimes it's going to be pickup. There's so many different permutations of it. But ultimately, it's all in orbit around this notion of allowing the customer to really be at the center of it. And I think that's what was missing in the past, 2 or 3 decades, agnostic of a specific type of retailer. And I think now everyone's sort of adapted their strategy to an extent where there's more of a conversation around the benefits and positives and utility of digital, but also the benefits and positives and utility of physical. And these things are entirely compatible with each other.
Yeah, another thing that I wanted to get your perspective on, we covered Starbucks' earnings for the eMarketer briefing. And I thought it was really interesting there that, of course, shocker, they mentioned Omicron to some extent and inflation looming large. But I thought it was also interesting the fact that they were emphasizing their employment benefits, their COVID isolation pay, calling it industry leading, and how they were investing a lot in training and onboarding capabilities. And, again, I'm curious more what you think, but it just really seems to me like this is yet another sign that the Great Resignation and employment is in a very peculiar place where a lot of people are really thinking about where is that going to go? How do you get retail blue-collar employees very interested in being your front line, from a retail perspective? But what do you think? Is that going to be a major storyline through 2022?
Well, I think it's one of these areas that's been sort of ripe for change for a long time, where I think a lot of retailers, restaurants, there's a lot of different positions that are predominantly in the physical world that are consumer facing that have been underpaid and or mishandled by a lot of larger companies over the years, where it's sort of been seen that you could offer fewer benefits, you can sort of push people into different sort of pay structures or employment structures that avoid having a larger conversation around trying to foster a really sort of long-term workforce. And I think Starbucks, to my knowledge, has always been fairly progressive on that front. They were one of the early companies to start offering tuition reimbursements and otherwise. And so there's all these perks that you would certainly want to speak to. And I think, it's certainly in context of the pandemic being very favorable from the perspective of ensuring people feel the comfort so that if they are feeling unwell, that they can take time away, or if they are getting vaccinated and they have, side effects and don't feel well for a couple of days, that they can take time away without penalty. These things are crucial, but they're also kind of table stakes in this marketplace. And ultimately what it comes down to is, how can you pay people appropriately? And, you talk about that in context of inflation, sure, makes a lot of sense, but it's also in context of just an overdue need where I think people were really getting away with paying at or below minimum wage and often coming up with commission structures or otherwise to make up the gap. And I just don't think that that is the motivating factor for a lot of people. I think people want to believe in where they work, and there's more to these experiences than I think a lot of these companies were considering previously. And so I think these days, historically in the retail space, turnover in stores has been just sort of an accepted aspect of the industry, and hiring for physical stores in particular is seen to be this incredibly difficult thing. And there's people that sort of specialize in consulting for all these different areas. But I think, at the end of the day, it comes down to a relatively simple proposition of whether you can maintain, a good place to work, whether that's a combination of how you pay, how you offer benefits and otherwise. And all these things ladder up to the overall narrative and story of what you're trying to do as an organization and what autonomy that brings. And so this has obviously been a crucial thing for us from the beginning. And I can't say we've gotten it right every time, but we've faced much less turnover than what would have been typical in the industry through the pandemic. And even, before that. And it's always just been for us, a push to see what more we can do.
You're kind of reading my mind, but I want to ask you about that when we get to, the next portion. Those are great perspectives. And let's get to that in a second. We're going to actually take a quick word from our sponsor, Mountain, and then we'll be right back.
What if launching a streaming TV ad campaign was as easy as posting on social media? With Mountain, it is. Their marketing software solution offers an easy way to buy, manage, and measure connected TV campaigns. Ads are served exclusively on premium streaming networks and apps and optimized by automated media buying technology to ensure ads are served to the right viewer at the right time to prompt website visits and conversions. Visit mountain.com to learn more.
All right, now it's time for our brief case study, where we look at a recent brand campaign or deployment and discuss what went right and some lessons for next time. First off, Matt, I'm pretty familiar with your work, but for listeners who are less familiar with your brand, give them in a nutshell, why should they care? I feel like it sounds a little bit cooler coming from you versus me. So
I'm not so sure about that. But yeah, we, for all the reasons we were sort of talking about in terms of customers looking for discovery and balance with convenience, and for teams looking for a place that they can feel passionate about and where they feel empowered and cared for. We've always been out to sort of solve for both of those in context of the sort of department store space. So working with a lot of different brands, both established as well as direct to consumer, sort of upstarts as well as local brands, helping bring them into the physical retail ecosystem to serve a broader spectrum of goals than what would be typical. So historically, it's just been a wholesale relationship with brands to sell product in a space. With us, we bring brands in, and of course, many want to accomplish sales, but for many, it's also about customer acquisition. It's about data. It's about demographics. It's about understanding a physical retail strategy to inform a broader strategy they may develop of their own. And then for our teams, it's about storytelling and creating something that can be this really sort of vibrant space. And so we call ourselves a new type of department store, and we're really not that much of a department store. Each of our spaces are quite different and offers a different mix to a different location, but it's all very much rooted in this idea of relevance, right? Where I think a lot of these retailers, especially in the department store space, are sort of one size fits all. And with us, it's been much more about creating these dynamic spaces that are very relevant to a given location, where we have our restaurants inside each one, event programming, and then all sorts of different really exciting brands that otherwise you wouldn't really find in physical retail.
And let me put you on the spot. I'm wondering what 2021 growth metrics you can share, and feel free to focus on anything you haven't publicly spoken about before. Don't be shy.
From a retail perspective, we grew about 140% year over year. And then from an F&B perspective, we grew about 277% year over year off the top of my head. We didn't open any additional stores. And so it was just building on the stores from the year prior. And of course, we were closed for a few months in the year prior. So that sort of it plays into some of the numbers. But generally, we were really pleased. We saw a lot of growth. And, you know, in 2020, by comparison to 2019, we grew over 100% year over year as well from a growth perspective. And so, you know, we've just sort of continued on this trajectory of really sort of doubling the business or more. I think seeing the restaurants really grow to the extent they did was a little bit unexpected, if I'm totally honest, but very exciting and ratifying for what we had thought of F&B for our model. And then from a retail perspective, even a traffic perspective, I think traffic for us grew about 104, 105% year over year. And so, you know, all these sort of metrics were over what we were seeing before the pandemic. But the main thing that had happened during the pandemic was less traffic and higher conversion. What was interesting is, I think what really contributed to the growth was that we retained that higher conversion rate, but traffic was also just way back up as well. So that's a combination of, you know, our teams and our concept, you know, maturing, but also I think building more brand equity and a little bit more of intention in the people coming to visit our spaces, and also just being in the right locations to sort of meet the moment.
Yeah, you know, I think one thing that's interesting to me is I think about your model is very experiential, and it's all about, as kind of you were alluding to, part of the benefit that retail has is just discovery. You know, we haven't found a great way to replicate discovery online in quite the same way, even though a lot of great people are trying. But you know, sampling is a thing that I feel like hasn't been covered all that much. And I'm wondering, how does sampling come to life via an experiential retail environment like yours in a way that was kind of lost during the peak days of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic really sort of crystallized our purpose as sort of how you socialize and contextualize products. So in context of apparel and otherwise, it's very much about the right brand adjacencies. A lot of these are very traditional considerations. During the pandemic, though, we also launched a concept called the marketplace, which is a sort of rotating mix of CPG brands that are also predominantly direct to consumer and really high growth that you otherwise wouldn't have easy access to in a lot of stores. And a lot of them actually during the pandemic did get into, you know, grocery stores like Whole Foods or otherwise, which is great for them. But most of these places were not doing sampling during the pandemic. And so for people that are otherwise on sort of rails when they're at the grocery store, it's hard to have those moments of discovery. And you may see the ads on Instagram, you may end up on the website, but still sort of shopping in that sort of context may not be as entirely intuitive. And so we launched this concept to feature these brands in store, but also to integrate them into the menus at our restaurant. And so it was about mentioning a brand like Truff in the same breath as a brand like Aesop, which otherwise wouldn't happen. But it was also about taking brands like, you know, Fly by Jing, which is a great sort of cult favorite sort of seasoning brand. And rather than doing them in a very linear way in context of the food, we actually did a cocktail with them. And we did, with Parlor Coffee, we did a coffee rubbed burger and stuff like that on the restaurant menus in each of our locations. And that
of course, we're talking before I've had lunch. So thanks a lot for that.
And so it's just been one of those things where I think, you know, for a lot of brands, they're trying to get in front of a fairly similar audience. And ultimately what they're vying for is some degree of social validation, seeing people eat, drink, shop, try different clothing on in a very edited and very particular environment, and then localizing that to a given audience can be quite influential and quite impactful. And so that's really something that we've looked to sort of play with. And so that happens in the format of a concept like the marketplace and our restaurants, but it also happens in all sorts of different things that we do as a business.
And I think another thing that you kind of alluded to before that's a valuable thing is, you know, I remember as a brand marketer, I used to partner with retailers who basically said, hey, you want some information? Good luck prying it out of my hands. But in some ways, it seems to me one of the differences is that, you know, you're actively talking to brands as hey, listen, we might have some insights that will actually help you build your brand. And I'm wondering if you have any examples off the top of your head of brands that have, you know, leveraged some of those insights from working with you in order to, you know, launch direct to consumer or succeed in other channels.
We've worked with all sorts of brands, and we've been first physical retail for a lot of them. You know, Hims now is publicly traded, and we were their first ever physical retail. We were Dollar Shave Club's first ever physical retail. I think we were Tonal's first ever physical retail. And there's a lot of really interesting examples that come up with all of them. I think Dollar Shave Club is a particularly interesting one where they rolled out across all three of our stores. So, Plano, just outside of Dallas, a suburban market, Austin on South Congress, very up and coming, very influential, very trendy. And then Chelsea Market in New York, obviously just really sort of high foot traffic and otherwise. In Plano, they had about 400 or 500 square feet where it became an exercise in really introducing the brand to a customer that may not be as entirely sort of aware of them as you might find in a market like New York. And so it became this really fun exercise in how you tell that broader story, how you introduce additional products in their line beyond just shaving. And it was this really sort of special moment there. Whereas in New York, they just had a few shelves and a blended beauty and wellness section because it was really more about utility there and speaking to active subscribers or customers that might be commuting and just need to grab something while they're in the city, or to the sort of tourist crowd that just want to grab something and bring it with them. And then our Austin location sort of spoke to both sort of ideas. And so we tried to partner with each brand and try to, in particular, I think, open up the conversation beyond just the name of a location, because a lot of these direct-to-consumer brands, they don't have a distinct sort of real estate team, nor do they often have a lot of experience there. And so they naturally just want to open where they've seen others open, which means Soho in New York or otherwise. And they'll probably do fine there. It's a great customer, but there's a lot more you can do depending on your goals. And so we try to think of real estate a little bit differently, where it's about finding locations and real estate types that suit and offer different goal sets to meet different needs on behalf of different brands.
I was going to ask you about that in terms of your expansion plans from a retail footprint perspective in 2022. I know obviously each location is a little bit different, and I think you're very conscientious in terms of the decisions that you're making. But what are your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, so we are going to be opening 2 in California in the first half of this year, which is an entirely new market for us. And then we're hoping to open another additional sort of 1 or 2 towards the end of the year. We've always talked about this opportunity to sort of have a belt across the country. So 2 in California, 2 in Texas, and then at the moment 1 in New York. It gives us this real sort of opportunity for efficiency in markets in between, where we see a lot of excitement around markets like an Atlanta or a Nashville or a Seattle. And so we're thinking about that sort of opportunity to have that belt first and foremost, and then we see opportunity to build on top of that this year. And so we'd intended to open new stores in 2020, and then obviously the pandemic slowed everything down, and we wanted to sort of see how that played out. And as I shared up top, we ended up doing quite well, unexpectedly, but still had a lot to build on and improve as a relatively young business. And in 2021, we really started to restart the process. And so we've been working on these locations for a while, and we're excited to sort of get back out there. So they're going to continue the sort of thesis where, we're going to have a blend of major metropolitan, up-and-coming markets, suburban markets, and probably some seasonal and international opportunities, and maybe in some extreme circumstances, some enclosed malls.
As you're trying to think about how to be appropriate for each location, and that's one of the, I think, best things that I've heard about what you're building is that, you're sensitive to where you're launching, what are the psychographics and demographics of each location, what's going to be appropriate for those. But how do you plan on expanding into new categories over the next year? And then how do you try not to be a jack of all trades and master of none, right? Because of course it's difficult to launch into new categories.
Yeah, I don't know how many more categories we'll get into. Well, we've been investing a lot of time and energy into exclusives and collaborations and how we localize those. So we've been doing partnerships with, really up and coming interesting brands like The Arrivals, as well as established brands like Skagen and Fossil. And we have a lot more to do there. I think for us, it's about how we flesh out the brand mix. But at the end of the day, really just try to lead with taste above all else, where I think a lot of retailers, even really well-established companies like Macy's and otherwise, have all announced intention to really build marketplaces. The trouble with a marketplace is that it sort of features a little bit of everything and by association kind of nothing, right? It sort of lacks perspective and doesn't really give the consumer much of a reason. So I think there's a question as to how that plays out. I think where we want to spend most of our time is thinking about saying no more than we're saying yes, and have a very, very particular assortment that, as we've discussed, is localized to a given market.
I think of you guys as curated to some extent, and I think I don't want to speak for some of those other competitors, and you might not want to, but it seems that for everybody else, they're just thinking about volume and not necessarily that aspect of curation.
Yeah, and so I think for us, we really want to focus on the why. And so, when we opened in New York, the Fast Company subheadline was Bye Bye Barney's Hello Neighborhood Goods. And I don't think we live up to that yet, but I think it is philosophically where we can go. And so when we first opened in Plano in 2018, we had 26 brands at launch or thereabouts. And today that location has 134 or thereabouts. And so it's not that we suddenly are just like stuffed full of products and brands. It's more that we have more brands, but more particular products from each one that are really down to a very particular level of curation suited to a given market. And then that changes all the time, right? So those brands are changing in and out, the products are changing in and out, and we're finding different ways to communicate that. And so as we grow, I think it's continuing to push ourselves to think about sort of excellence in a given category. How do we have more exclusives? How do we speak to both that sort of convenience and utility piece as well as the discovery piece? So you continue to introduce brands into physical retail for the first time. We're doing it right now. We have all sorts of brands launching. We have, between sort of 5 to 10 brands launched every week in Q4 last year, and we're sort of continuing that momentum. And some of them are big names, like DS and Durga and Fashion File and all sorts of others. And then others are, really sort of local upstart concepts that you probably haven't heard of before. And I think that's the fun of it. It creates excitement and sort of reason to continue coming back for the consumer. And it really helps us to sort of continue to push forward and find a point of real differentiation. So I think design-wise, experience-wise, there's already a big difference where we focus on, there's just very sort of classic, sort of dignified experience. And then from there, it's very much about, yes, how we lean into taste, how we lean into curation, and how we lean into, above all else, relevance.
And, I know you're talking about how you differentiate. I wanted to come back to what I was going to have as my last question. A lot of people were highly stressed out during, the peak days of the pandemic. And I noticed your Summer Mondays initiative. And I was curious, how important is it for you to not just, be good to your team members through a program like that, but to also try to say something to the outside world about what your brand values are?
Yeah, Summer Mondays, I think, is a good example of a project that I think is very philosophically aligned with where we want to go this year and beyond, where it was in the summer last year, we were reading just like everyone else was about, the expected burnout of sort of returning to some degree of normalcy. This was before a lot of the variants had hit. And we were sort of much more in a conversation of optimism following the initial wave of vaccinations and otherwise. And there was this sort of looming anxiety of returning to offices or what those policies were going to look like. And we've always said that we're not going to make anyone go back to the office. That's going to be optional. It's there if they want it. But we started to think about how we can give people space. And so, most crucially, our store teams have been wearing masks all day, every day to work and facing, people that were very against masks or all sorts of ends of the spectrum and making it a really sort of difficult sort of day in some instances and difficult weeks, difficult time. And so we, have all seen a lot of sort of corporate companies that offer Summer Mondays, and it's typically been a very sort of white collar privilege to have, every other Friday or every Friday off during the summer. And we thought about whether we could do it for retail. And it went from an idea to policy and enacted within, 10 days. And we just decided that we were going to close our stores every other Monday and our corporate office every other Monday for the summer. And we encouraged people to take time and share what they were going to get up to and otherwise. And we did a little sort of digital exclusive on those Mondays. And we didn't emphasize it too much. We didn't like push it from a, media angle or otherwise. It was just something we wanted to do and we thought would be the right thing. We, I think, have an opportunity to sort of continue to push ourselves to see what we can do to create a really sort of great environment. And that's not something that we're always going to get perfectly right. These things are always fluid and evolving. But Summer Mondays, I think, was the right sort of thing for us to continue to push on and continue to experiment with. And so, we've pushed ourselves to do a lot. We provide equity to everyone on the teams. We've improved pay a couple of times during the pandemic, and we're going to continue to push ourselves to see what more we can do. But I think those sorts of ideas and those sorts of experiments, it's really something that we can sort of continue to sort of strive for and to see what it can do in terms of unlocking mental capacity for our teams, which hopefully can also yield, like improved performance and otherwise, like a better work-life balance. All these different things make a big difference. And so, we're still at the very beginning of that journey. Like we have hectic moments just like anyone else, and we don't always get these things right. And, even though we do Summer Mondays, there's still challenges wearing masks to work all day, every day. And there's still people that come in to pick fights with the store teams and otherwise. Like, it's not that it's perfect, but I think it's more about intent and it's more about character and how we can try to push and sort of see what we can do to sort of innovate there internally as much as we do externally.
Trying to show that you stand for something. I think that, it makes a lot of sense. Matt, this has been fantastic. We'd like to ask people at the very end for their parting shot. Okay, what are 2 brands you particularly admire and you draw inspiration from? And, just to not offend anybody, I will say that you cannot name any brands that you carry right now. How's that?
Okay, great. In the retail space, my go-to answer is that I've always been a big fan of what the team are doing at Camp, which is a very experience-driven sort of kids retailing concept. And I think they look at it as sort of experiential retail in a different way than us, but it's incredibly appropriate for that category. And I think they do an incredible job. And it's just been really exciting to watch them. Beyond that, I don't know, there's so many different sort of that I could name. I mentioned, in the sort of quickfire up top, and it's just an easy one to reach for again. But I think Slack is an interesting case study as a company that works in the enterprise space, but doesn't come across as an enterprise company. And I think the way they do something as simple as release notes when they do app updates is an incredible example of that sort of approach where you read the release notes for a new version of, a Microsoft app or a Google app, and it's usually just, bug fixes and improvements. You read them from Slack and they usually tell a little bit of a story and speak to where they are and how they're thinking about things. And it's a small touch, but it makes a big difference. And so, I think there's a bigger conversation around like work-life balance and communication tools like that. But I also think that what they've done from a narrative perspective and building that brand is really, really, really remarkable.
Not only that, but I think during this conversation, I've gotten about 17 Slacks from teammates. So they're doing something right. Yeah. But Matt, this was really fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. Let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you at podcast@emarketer.com. I'll be back in 2 weeks for another episode of the Behind the Numbers Brand Anatomy. Make sure to tune in tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily and eMarketer podcast made possible by Mountain.